Okay,
There we go.
perfect. Okay, everyone, thank you, Mark, for getting us going. And good evening from Fredericton. And welcome to the webinar, More Nuclear Energy in Canada's Energy Future, ? My name is Janice Harvey, and I'm an assistant professor and coordinator of the Environment and Society program at St. Thomas University. I'm also involved with the CEDAR research project at St. Thomas, who is a co-host of this event, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. So St. Thomas is located on the unceded and unconquered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, a place bound by several peace and friendship treaties signed between 1725 and 1779. And tonight's speakers are across the country in New Brunswick, Ontario, and British Columbia. And I realize I say tonight, but it isn't tonight in British Columbia. That's just an Atlantic phenomenon, I guess. So this panel was assembled originally for the Socialist Studies Conference in Montreal in June of this year. And since academic conferences don't often have a very broad reach, this event gives you, the audience, an opportunity to hear from these speakers, and it gives the speakers an opportunity to update their research. So this webinar is organized by the Sustainable Energy Initiative at York University, whose mandate is to build and strengthen research, education, and skills for students and professionals in energy efficiency and conservation, renewable energy, and community energy planning. The co-host is the CEDAR project at St. Thomas University. CEDAR is short for Contesting Energy Discourses Through Action Research, a 5-year research project studying energy transitions in Canada with a focus in New Brunswick and on nuclear energy as a contested transition technology. And this project is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. So we have 4 presentations this evening, each one being about 12 minutes in length. And I will give the speakers a little heads up at 11 minutes, and then they can figure out how they want to wrap up from that point. We'll follow the 4 presentations with a Q&A session, and I'll ask you, well, you'll be able to raise your hand to ask questions, but you can also use the chat, and we have a York student, Beatrice, who will be monitoring the chat for anything that you might put there that would be good to share with the group. So with those preliminaries behind us, let's get to the main event. The 4 presenters this evening are M.V. Ramana from UBC, Susan O'Donnell and Emma Fackenthal at St. Thomas, Laura Tanguay at York University, and Mark Winfield also at York. So their biographies are fresh in your mind. I will provide these before each speaker. So if we're ready to go, I'll introduce the first speaker, is M.V. Ramana. Ramana holds the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global Human Security, and is professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. He is the author of many publications, including the 2012 book, Power of Promise, examining nuclear energy in India, and the just released a month or so ago book, Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. He is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, the Disarmament-focused Pugwash Group, and the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. Ramana has received the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Leo Szilard Award from the American Physical Society. So Ramana's presentation is titled Small Modular Reactors, Nuclear Fantasies for the Interregnum. So Brahmana, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Janice. And it's a pleasure to join you. And I'm joining from the ancestral, traditional, unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And as Janice mentioned, this is a talk that was originally given at the Society of Socialist Studies, but it has been updated. And among the updates is also the title for the talk, which I changed.
Oh,
To talk a little bit about the context and the realities, though I will talk a little bit about small modular reactors as well. Uh, so to start with, I think I will just set the stage by mentioning something which most of you know who are attending, that there has been a lot of talk about Canada embarking on a new round of nuclear reactor construction. It has come from the highest authorities, people like Justin Trudeau sort of talking about nuclear being on the table. Um, and from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which has been also advocating for small modular reactors, even though it's supposedly only supposed to regulate them. But its role has been much more an advocacy kind of role. And various provinces which are talking about building nuclear reactors. Ontario is leading the way with a small modular reactor design project in Darlington. And just this week, we saw news about Alberta talking about a private company there talking about building large nuclear plants. So that's the larger context in which we are having this discussion. And I think, as all the panelists would talk about, there's some serious questions to be asked about this emphasis. But before we sort of get to that, you'll see a lot of discussion about, this being a nuclear renaissance or a revival of nuclear power and things like that. Why are these terms even being used? And to understand that, I'll just give a little bit of a context about where we are with respect to nuclear energy around the world. So the first thing to remember about nuclear power is that the best days of nuclear reactor construction have been finished over 3 decades ago. If you look at the nuclear plants around the world, there are, something of the order of 400 plants, and these are mostly constructed in the 1970s and 1980s. And after the highest number of reactors that were, this plot here shows the number of reactors that were connected to the electricity grid every year. That started in 1954, and it has been updated to earlier this year. And what we see here is that the maximum number of reactors being connected to the grid happened in the years 1984 and 1985, when there were about 33 reactors connected to the grid. After that, the decline was fairly swift. And once you get to the 1990s, we see that in many years, there are more reactors that are actually taken off the grid than being connected to the grid. So that pattern basically means that the total number of reactors has been roughly constant since the 1990s. And the other essential fact to remember about nuclear reactor construction is that the construction takes a long time. This plot here shows the time it took between when construction starts, which is conventionally considered to be when the first concrete is poured on the ground, to the point where the reactor starts producing electricity and supplies it to the grid. And what we see here is that construction periods can vary tremendously. There have been reactors that have been under construction for decades in some cases, and some of them are quite short. But on average, it takes roughly about 10 years between when construction starts and electricity starts being supplied to the grid. Therefore, if Alberta, for example, or British Columbia were to embark on nuclear power plant construction, it would take them at least 10 years for the first units of electricity to flow. However, That's not the whole story, because BC or Alberta cannot start constructing reactors immediately. They would have to go through some environmental clearances. There would have to be safety assessments of the site. A community would have to be found that is willing to live near this risky facility, because the bulk of the impact of a nuclear reactor accident accrues to the communities that live near these plants. So they obviously will be concerned about it. And there's a history of opposition to new reactor sites ever since the 1970s and 1980s. And last but not least, any reactor construction cannot start before you raise the tens of billions of dollars that it takes to build one of these plants. And so if BC, for example, were to decide to build a plant, it would take them 15 to 20 years before the first units of electricity actually flow, because it takes another 5 to 10 years to do all of this other pre-construction processes. So it'll be the 2040s before we see any kind of electricity. So that's another fact you want to remember. And that, in combination with the fact that many reactors, I mean, there's been very few reactors being constructed, means that the share of electricity that nuclear power plants around the world have been supplying to the grids has been declining consistently since the mid 1990s. The highest it ever was in 1996, when it was 17.5%. And since then, it's declined continuously. It's now just over 9% in the year 2023. And in contrast, modern renewables, by which I mean not large hydro dams, of which we have a lot in Canada, but things like solar and wind, those have been growing very fast in recent decades, largely because of the huge cost declines of those technologies. So this is the background to understanding why we have to talk about a revival of nuclear power rather than just nuclear power. Okay. All right. Now, when the nuclear industry, when you're sort of confronting them with these facts about how the nuclear share is declining, how there's been a general lull in nuclear reactor construction, they would immediately say, oh, well, this is all a thing of the past. We have a new round of nuclear reactor designs. Usually these days we talk about small modular reactors, but you can also hear the terms like advanced reactors and generation 4 reactors and micro reactors and so on. And the idea is that these will change this pattern, all right? And that is, if you look at it in some detail, that's never going to happen. So I briefly mentioned the fact that nuclear reactors are expensive to build. That's one of the challenges. So economics is one major challenge. Nuclear power, even advocates for nuclear power, will also admit to 3 other major challenges. One is the risk of accidents, again, which I mentioned very briefly. Severe accidents like what happened in Chernobyl and Fukushima have been a huge problem for the nuclear industry. The third problem is the fact that all nuclear power plants will necessarily produce radioactive waste. That's an inherent part of the nuclear power generation process. And so that's another challenge. And there is no demonstrated way to deal with this radioactive waste from nuclear power plants. And the last is the linkage between the generation of nuclear power and the production of material for nuclear weapons and the capacity to build nuclear weapons that a country might accrue, what is called nuclear weapons proliferation. And all of these are challenges that even the nuclear industry will admit. And if you think about what it would take to build reactors that might reduce each of these challenges, what you'll find is that when you try to encapsulate these priorities in an actual reactor design, the design elements will be pushing in very different directions. The demands on the design will be very different. So for example, a reactor that reduces the amount of radioactive waste that is produced will necessarily increase the risk of proliferation because of the nature of how that nuclear reactor will have to be in order to reduce the amount of radioactive waste generated, and so on and so forth. So all desirable properties will not be realizable in a single design. The second point is that in terms of small modular reactors, the most important thing to remember is that a smaller reactor means that the per unit capacity, either in terms of units of power or units of energy, the cost of producing electricity from a smaller reactor will be higher than for a large reactor on a per unit basis. And the reason has to do with what are called economies of scale. I can talk more about this in the question and answer session. But when you make a reactor smaller, you lose out on certain efficiencies. And that also means it's also going to produce more spent fuel and waste per unit of electricity generation. So that's something to remember. And we see this loss of economies of scale in the cost estimates for small modular reactors that have been proposed in many different countries of the world. These are estimated costs. These are not real costs because we don't really know in some cases what the actual cost is. And in some cases, there's been no construction, so we don't know what it is. But what we know is that this is all much higher than what have been the typical cost estimates for large reactors. So there are real economic losses when you go to smaller reactors. In Canada, small modular reactors have been promoted by arguing that we might need to use these kinds of reactors for remote mines and communities which are not connected to the grid. And the argument there is that these are all typically reliant on diesel. Diesel is very expensive, especially when you have to transport it to these remote areas. But this argument, when we look at the numbers, and my colleagues and I did some calculations on what might be the typical cost of a small modular reactor and how much the electricity would cost. And what we found was that it could be up to 10 times as much as diesel, and diesel is already expensive. So small modular reactors will not be an economic solution to these energy challenges for remote communities. What's more, the amount of market for these kinds of remote communities is too small for to build a viable small modular reactor factory and an industry that is going to support the production of these things. So this argument really does not make sense. Okay, let me sort of try to end by asking, the question that some other argument that many people will say here is that, well, all these problems may be there with nuclear power, but we need it to deal with climate change. And this is what I have sort of taken on in the book that Janice mentioned. I'm not going to summarize the whole book, but I'll just very briefly mention that there are sort of two sets of arguments that one should remember. The first is that nuclear power is not a feasible way to deal with climate change. Nuclear power plants are very expensive, as I mentioned. So for each nuclear plant that you're not building, because you cannot use the same money twice, you're not building other quicker, cheaper solutions like renewables. And because those renewables are much cheaper and they're becoming cheaper, it's going to become even more true in the future. And the second is because it takes a long time to build a nuclear plant, the time that we have to reduce emissions does not allow us to be able to engage with nuclear power as a way to deal with climate change. And as the energy analyst Amory Lovins put it, he said, to protect the climate, we must abate the most carbon at the least cost and in the least time. And nuclear power just does not fit that. It's not the least cost way. It's not the least time way. And the other set of arguments about nuclear power are familiar to most. It's not even a desirable way to try and address this problem because, as I mentioned, it's not going to help you with climate change. But while if you're trying to attempt it, you're going to increase the risk of catastrophic accidents like what happened in Fukushima. You're going to increase the risk of proliferation, and you're going to produce radioactive waste for which we don't really have a good solution. I will end there, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ramana. I think you were pretty much right on the button in terms of 12 minutes. So that's a very impressive feat. Our next presenters are Susan O'Donnell and Emma Fackenthal. Susan O'Donnell is Adjunct Research Professor in Environment Society at St. Thomas University. Dr. O'Donnell is the lead investigator for the CEDAR project, contesting energy discourses through action research. Her current area of research is the social and political context of nuclear energy and government and media discourse on nuclear power. She is also an activist with the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. Emma Fackenthal is a fourth-year student at St. Thomas, pursuing a double major in Environment, Society, and English, as well as a double minor in Communications and Public Policy and Criminology. Emma has been a research assistant for nearly 2 years, first as part of the Plutonium Project, studying the impacts of radioactive waste from SMRs, and for the past year with the CEDAR Project studying nuclear discourses in New Brunswick media. She has had 2 articles published in the MB Media Co-op on nuclear issues. So Emma and Susan's presentation is titled Nuclear Power in the Media. So over to you, Emma and Susan.
I just realized. Right. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do this today. I'm here with Emma, as you can see, and we're going to be doing this together. Just to acknowledge that St. Thomas University is located on the unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik, and as Janice mentioned earlier, we're bound by the Peace and Friendship Treaties. So our study that we're working on, part of the CEDAR project, is analyzing media discourse about nuclear energy. And by media discourse, that refers to what is actually written, but also how the texts are produced. So who owns the media, whose voices predominate, and this becomes important when we're trying to understand why what is written about nuclear power is written. In the literature, we would talk about something called hegemonic discourses. And so this refers to ideas and values that become the dominant way of thinking in a society. When you think of discourses about many things, including nuclear energy, but including about a range of topical issues, these are the ideas that are promoted by those in power. And they're promoted through cultural institutions like education, but certainly through the mass media. And that's what we're looking through here today, is how nuclear power is promoted through the media. So the nuclear industry claims, of course, you've heard this before, that it's clean, safe, and a reliable energy source, and that it is nuclear energy is produced for the social good of Canada. That's particularly important in Canada, where we see ourselves as a leader in the non-weapons use of nuclear energy. That's really something that comes out of the federal government quite a bit. And then the other claim that we're looking at is that more reactors are required for climate action and the energy transition. So it's mass media does disseminate these claims, and this hegemonic or this dominant discourse, it builds support, public support for nuclear energy. So one of the reasons we're looking at this is to try and understand how people get the ideas that they do about nuclear energy, because for many reasons, whatever people think about nuclear energy will either support or not support, for example, more public funding that goes into developing new nuclear reactors. Our studies in New Brunswick, which has the only operating nuclear power reactor outside of Ontario. This article that we just snapped here is actually from the Globe and Mail, which is not a New Brunswick paper, but
Susan, your slides are not showing.
oh.
I thought you were just reading out some text and I didn't.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay. I appreciate that. We are now sharing. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, so this is a picture of something, a clip from the Globe and Mail, and this is actually the Darlington Nuclear Station. So as I mentioned, the hegemonic discourse or the dominant discourse builds public support for nuclear energy. Studies in New Brunswick. And because New Brunswick is the only officially bilingual province, we're studying both English and French media. We're looking at 3 media sources. The New Brunswick Telegraph Journal, which publishes in English only, the Acadie Nouvelle in French only, and the NB Media Co-op, which publishes primarily in English, but does have some French content. And again, what we're looking for is to analyze what are the dominant discourses and also the counter discourses about nuclear energy in these through publications. So the New Brunswick Telegraph Journal is the newspaper of record in New Brunswick. It's been published for well over 100 years. And about 80 years ago, it was bought by the Irving family of companies, J.D. Irving in particular. And then just a couple of years ago, it was sold to the Post Media Network, which I'm sure would be familiar to many of you, which is a media company that represents well over 130 brands. While it was under the JDI, it was known as a neoliberal enterprise with ties to extractive industries. I've done research with colleagues on this before, but many others have also done work on this. And then after Post Media took it over, there wasn't really much of a change in terms of the context or the political orientation of the paper, I would say. The Post Media is recognized as the central neoliberal corporate press in Canada. It's owned by a hedge fund in New Jersey, as it happens, and this particular hedge fund has close ties with the Republican Party and right-wing media. So that's one of the papers we're looking at. Acadie Nouvelle is the only Francophone daily newspaper in New Brunswick. It began publishing about 40 years ago in the Acadian Peninsula. It's partially owned by a communications company based in Nova Scotia. And for the last almost 10 years, they also own a range of other media outlets as well. The interesting thing about, unlike the New Brunswick Telegraph Journal, the Acadie Nouvelle advocates for the Acadian culture and community. And so it has a particular community context. It has a very strong editorial voice, the strongest of all the three papers that we're looking at. I just have here that it supports the provincial Liberal Party. That's may possibly come into our analysis, and that's traditionally because most of the Francophone MLAs in New Brunswick are with the provincial party, are with the Liberal Party. The board and most of the staff are male, educated at the University of Moncton. And I'm mentioning this gender piece. We are thinking of possibly doing some kind of a feminist analysis of the work here. We're not sure where we're going with that yet. But we did note that the authorship of the stories in the study sample from Acadie Nouvelle were almost solely male. And then finally, the third publication that we're looking at is the New Brunswick Media Co-op, which is the longest running registered media cooperative in Canada. It's funded by memberships, donations, unions primarily. It has the online publication NB Media Co-op and also a broadsheet and a political talk show. It's part of a network of left media outlets across Canada, very much associated with activist groups, also members of the board of directors, of which I am one, and the editorial board affiliated with New Brunswick universities, and the stories take a social justice lens. So what we're looking at here, we're just finished the quantitative part of the study, looking at whose voices are predominant, and that's what Emma's going to talk about. And then the qualitative we'll come back to at the end, where we're going with the next steps. Thank you.
Okay, so our method, we selected articles from the three publications published from January to December in 3-year intervals. So we had 2011, 14, 17, 20, and 23. And we made a random sample that selected just about 50 articles that mentioned nuclear energy in each. And we looked at readers, excuse me, reader stats a little bit for the Telegraph Journal or for all the articles, but the NBTJ and Acadie Nouvelle are unknown. However, for the NB Media Co-op, server hit counts on nuclear stories on the study ranged from 600 just over 600 to over 7,000 reads each. So fellow research assistant Erin Hurley and I began coding using this template. And we looked at the article type. So that's the first category that we coded. And then we coded for the voices. So that's our second category here with 18 options. And we coded for the voice of the author and the voices within the articles. And our third category is the energy technologies discussed. So this chart is of the number of voices. And as we can see here, the NB Media Co-op has the most voices. And I think this is partly due to the fact that a lot of the articles in the co-op have multiple authors and have way more voices in the articles compared to the Académie Nouvelle and the Telegraph Journal. And this is a chart of all of our voice types. Some of the major ones, we have some more. As we can see here, the NB Media Co-op has a very large amount of NGO, academic, and public voices. But then if we look at the Telegraph Journal, it's mostly provincial, public utility, and business voices. And when we were reading the articles, Erin and I kind of noticed that often the government or the businesses will make claims or speak in the Telegraph or the Académie Nouvelle, and then the co-op kind of comes in as a public and informed response. And this is an interest chart. We took these from the author bios and also any linked LinkedIn pages. And as we can see for the NB Media Co-op, there's a very large interest in environment, nuclear technology, which is interesting. The co-op is the only one writing about with people with backgrounds in nuclear technology and writing on nuclear and peace, sustainable energy technologies and activism. The Telegraph Journal, on the other hand, does have some people interested in sustainable energy technologies, but I think that label was sometimes getting mixed up because they were calling nuclear a sustainable energy technology. And we can also see that the next most dominant interest is business for the Telegraph Journal. And so maybe this is sort of like a greenwashing rhetoric. And the Académie Nouvelle, I couldn't find a lot of their bios, not much on their websites, and they don't have a lot of LinkedIn pages, but they're not really interested in environment or nuclear. And this last chart is of article types. And as we can see here, the Académie Nouvelle and the Telegraph Journal have very large news article publications in our sample, and that's partly because they have staff journalists, whereas the co-op only had a staff journalist for the most recent years of our study, of our sample. What's interesting here is, as Susan noted, the strong editorial voice of the Académie Nouvelle, and also if you look at the letters, we have a lot of letters from the Telegraph Journal, but not a lot of public voices at all in the Telegraph Journal. So the people who are writing these letters are industry reps and businessmen, kind of, yeah. So next steps, we're going to look at what are the dominant and counter-hegemonic discourses about nuclear energy, and if the media reproduces or counters the nuclear industry's claims for clean, safe, and reliable energy for the social good of Canada, and if it's necessary for climate action, and if the media supports or counters the nuclear industry's call for public financing. I've already kind of started doing this by pulling articles that reference any sort of financing and doing a deeper dive on them to find out what are the financial issues being discussed and who is making those arguments. So yeah, I'm going to pass it over to Susan.
Thank you, Erin. Sorry, Emma. So yeah, we're looking at, as Emma mentioned, we have articles from, I guess it's 5 different periods, but
Yeah.
we're looking at 3 different years that are about 6 years apart or something like that. I can't remember what is now,
Yeah.
but we have a sort of a time phase that we're looking at, because the key point here is that hegemony is always fluid. And so we're looking at how the discourse changes over time and what factors are involved. We're aiming to submit a paper for peer review next spring. So we still have a fair bit of work to do, but basically what we're trying to understand is how people in New Brunswick get the ideas that they do about nuclear energy, because the public support or the lack of public support, the strength of public support for nuclear energy in New Brunswick is going to be a strong determining factor for how the province moves forward or not with its nuclear plans. So that's basically what we're trying to find out. So I think, and there's some of the articles that we're looking at. I think that's our time, Janice, right?
Yeah, just boy, everybody's bang on. That's you're being very, Very disciplined. Thank you for that presentation. Very interesting. So Laura Tenge is our next speaker. Laura is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. Laura's research focuses on participation and consent mechanisms in impact assessment contexts and the relationship between infrastructural violence and the green transition. Now I'm going to take a risk that the title is the title, but if it's not, then she'll correct us. So Laura's presentation is titled "No Depth in Shallow Promises: Unfolding the Green Narrative of Nuclear into the Burden of Waste." So Laura.
Thank you so much. That's yeah, the titles remain the same with just a few updates and actually a lot of reductions because I went way over the last time we did this. So I think it's a really, really nice transition here. I'm also calling in from Toronto, from the Treaty Lands and Territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So thanks for that. Good transition here because I'm going to start talking. Talking myself just to be sure my slides are showing. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about media just for a second. But so the reality is, yes, we do need to decarbonize our day-to-day lives. And the general consensus is that we'd really like to be able to do that without radically shifting any of our behaviors. And nuclear promises us that they can achieve this mission, achieve this. So when I walk around my neighborhood, I see these posters on the sides of streetcar stops. So this is Ontario Power Generation's Recast Nuclear campaign. They say that the nuclear industry's bad reputation is a consequence of pop culture and that it needs recasting. So I wonder here if they're talking about maybe Chernobyl. It's a miniseries on HBO that highlights the horrors of the reactor accident in the Ukraine. I thought maybe they could be talking about Oppenheimer, which generally celebrates an American physicist who developed nuclear bombs that created indiscriminate casualties in Japan during World War II. I don't know, there's other series and films that it could be talking about, but while these popular characterizations are jarring, they're not necessarily, and they're not entirely fictional. So my research is less cinematic than these examples, and it focuses more on the slow violence that results as from all stages of the nuclear fuel chain. I'm particularly interested in procedural equity in operationalizing radioactive waste disposal. I'm looking to see how we can ensure safety and justice for future generations so far into the future that they're beyond our collective imagination. I'm interested in why one permanent radioactive waste facility, the near surface disposal facility in Chalk River, which I'm going to call the NSDF. I'll try to only use two acronyms. They will be the NSDF and the DGR. And I'm talking about the Deep Geological Repository there. So this infrastructure, the DGR, does have a theoretical consent mechanism called the willing host model. And so that'll be the highlight of my presentation today, is the two differences here between these infrastructures. First, I did just mention the nuclear fuel chain. You might have heard it referred to as the nuclear fuel cycle, which I think is kind of misleading because, as this image shows, it focuses on reprocessing, which was banned and has been banned in Canada since 1977 because of the threat that it poses to nuclear non-proliferation agreements. So I'm going to talk about the nuclear fuel chain, which, as this image shows, all of the many processes involved in nuclear energy infrastructures end up creating waste. And eventually that waste is going to end up in some type of disposal infrastructure that will need perpetual care, monitoring, and significant investment. Again, for lifespans that we can't even really conceptualize. This is a map, it's an old map, but I'm interested in, it's from 1999. It's from Winona LaDuke's book, All Our Relations. So it actually cuts off some of the areas that I'll be talking about, but it gives an example of some of the overlay. And again, this is from 1999 of Indigenous jurisdictions and nuclear sites. So I would be really interested in a more contemporary version of this map, and one that sort of encompasses all of Turtle Island. But here is just interesting to see that there are almost always overlays of Indigenous jurisdiction and nuclear facility siting. Winona LaDuke also introduced a term called, she called it radioactive colonialism. Sometimes you'll hear nuclear colonialism, and I think it's a really useful concept to highlight how Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by the entire nuclear fuel chain, from uranium extraction and processing and the production of nuclear energy and the testing of nuclear weapons, which ultimately all again culminate in the disposal of long-lasting nuclear waste. And just before I get into my case study discussions, this is a very non-exhaustive list of just some of the other, aside from waste siting, some of the other opposition. So this is two examples in the Canadian context: the Serpent River resurgence, and I Will Live for Both of Us, both oppositions to uranium mining from different communities. And this is just a recent image of protesting or opposition from the Navajo Nation as a new uranium mine opens just south of the Grand Canyon. And there's been a new emergency law that's come up from the Navajo Nation around the issue of transporting through their territories. So social license was the first sort of like way that we talked about this willing host model. And so the first attempts to bury the waste happened in the mid-70s. In 78, the federal government and Ontario had a policy statement directed to Atomic Energy Canada Limited to develop a disposal technology and a storage technology, and they aimed for a site selection by 1983, with an operational deep geological repository, the DGR, by the year 2000, the new millennium. But public opposition put a wrench in this plan. Communities who were surveyed in the Canadian Shield, which was chosen because it's a stable rock formation, they had referendums that revealed the skepticism of this plan. So in 1981, there was a new policy that said there could be no disposal site chosen until a concept was socially approved. And some of these criteria for acceptance came out of the Seaborn panel. So we're still at the DGR for one of the waste siting. So it's still on the table. The two locations are in South Bruce and Ignace, or Northwestern Ontario. They're the final candidates for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's proposal for a DGR. The NWMO is a not-for-profit corporation that's comprised of nuclear power companies who generate the waste and who own the waste, and they are seeking a solution to house the waste. So the NWMO's host community in Northwestern Ontario is Ignace. It's a small community along the Trans-Canada Highway. It's 45 kilometers east of the proposed DGR site, and it's not just upstream. It's actually in a different watershed than the DGR. And this site has faced opposition from Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups. Oops, sorry. I distracted myself there from the chat. That's my mistake. From Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups who argue that the project reinforces Northern Ontario's history as a resource extraction and waste disposal zone. Smaller communities closer to the site are not part of the NWMO's willingness process. And in this case, the NWMO also won't go ahead without Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation's consent, but other First Nations who will be on the transportation route or who have historic and ongoing land use near or overlapping the project area are also not part of this willingness process. Sorry, I skipped ahead my slides, but the previous slide, which for some reason I can't go back to, it showed an image of a group who was opposing the DGR in Ignace, and that was 5 First Nations from the area, and just so they emphasized that they have not been consulted and that the proceeding without their consent violates the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And last week on October 2nd, there are now 12 First Nations who have joined to, they held a rally in Thunder Bay to oppose radioactive waste storage in the north, also sharing concerns about the risk of transportation accidents and of long-term leaks. So this is the DGR as shown at the Bruce site. And South Bruce neighbors the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station, and it is in the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, which includes Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nawash, unceded First Nation. So prior to the NWMO's, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's proposal for this DGR, Ontario Power Generation proposed a DGR on Saugeen Ojibwe Nation's territory, and in 2020, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation overwhelmingly voted against it. So despite this ongoing contention, the site selection is expected to be announced at any time. By the end of 2024, I've heard it promised. So these are some of the elements of free, prior, and informed consent that are being sought by First Nations, which is an article of the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, so that the consent must be free, without coercion or intimidation or manipulation, and must be informed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that too, about some of the way that this criteria is shown or not within the willing host model. The near surface disposal facility, or the NSDF, I'm really trying to minimize my my letters that I'm using here. But so the NSDF, it looks like this. It's a 37 hectare mound. It's 1.1 kilometers from the Ottawa River. It's proposed to be, sorry, it is not, it's not being constructed just yet. It's proposed to remain open at the top for over 50 years and to house more than 1 million cubic meters of radioactive waste that will require at least 300 years of stewardship. And it's being proposed on the site of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories on unceded Algonquin territory. So the stark difference between the NSDF and the DGR in terms of processes is that one has this willing host model where the communities theoretically have the opportunity to provide or withhold consent, and the NSDF does not. The participation mechanisms in the NSDF siting are reduced to consultation. And there have been many instances that show that this is evidently inadequate consultation. The majority of Algonquin nations have been organizing opposition and action against the proposed infrastructure of the NSDF since they were first made aware of the project through official channels like hearings and consultations, legal challenges, including a recent in July federal appeal for judicial review of the licensing decision. And during that appeal, I heard the proponent say that there was going to be minimal impacts, that's one of the reasons that this site licensing is happening, is because there will be minimal impacts to unceded Algonquin territory. And when asked about how essentially extinguishing the rights entitled to this area for forever is not a minimal impact, they said, since this area has already been occupied since the 1940s as part of Canadian Nuclear Laboratory site, it won't be a difference. So I think that that's a really major concern that came out of this appeal. These are some of the other procedural inequities here that are between the two infrastructures. And these are some of the bigger questions, I guess, that I have with both processes. So in terms of the willing host model, how and who defines willingness, and who determines the scope of the community, and how is that determined? And is it an Indigenous-led process, or is it something that is defined by the NWMO, and how do we ensure that there is justice while designing these decision-making structures that are going to affect beyond 7 generations into the future. And in terms of the NSDF and the duty to consult, there's the lack of FPIC, the lack of UNDRIP principles that are being upheld during the consultation. So there's no opportunity for consent, which I show here Article 29.2, which actually says that hazardous waste can't be sited on Indigenous land without their consent. Okay, so there's also the amount of time and resources that have been allocated to this project. So Kebewek First Nation and Kitigan Zibi Anishinabeg undertook an Indigenous-led assessment for the NSDF proposal, and which exposed many of the shortcomings of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories' own assessment. And also, while actualizing this assessment was met with a lot of resistance from the proponents. So there was some blockings of putting camera traps and some resistance to being able to access the site that is on their unceded territory. The consultations and licensing hearings extended for over 5 years, including during some of the lockdowns for COVID-19. And experts also provided evidence that there have been errors in information delivered to stakeholders from CNL, including the risk categorization of the waste proposed to be housed. So for example, one of those big ones is that not all of the waste that will go into the mound is actually low-level waste. And some of the other concerns, the transportation concern is a big one, both with the DGR and the NSDF, because originally was alluded to that the waste that is going into the NSDF is waste that already exists on the site and needs to be stored more carefully, but waste is also going to be coming in from White Shell in Manitoba as well. Following the NSDF licensing decision, Kebewek First Nation issued a press release that called the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's decision unacceptable, and it highlighted community concerns of intergenerational safety and intergenerational equity because of the expectation that the mound will degrade through normal evolution, releasing radioactive and hazardous materials into a nearby wetland and the Kichisibi, the Ottawa River, during its operation and after its closure. And this is only what we can expect. It doesn't account for the unknowns that might occur over the next 300 plus years. So it's not only Algonquin communities who oppose the NSDF, it's also over 140 municipalities in Quebec and Ontario, as well as several civil society organizations. And this is an older sort of analysis, but this looked at all of the interventions that were submitted for the near surface disposal facility. And it shows that support for the project comes almost exclusively from industry, while voices opposing come from broad backgrounds. So I'm gonna leave it there, but some of my main questions that have arisen from this research are whether it is ethical to divorce the concept of clean nuclear energy from the environmental, social, and cultural impacts of uranium mining and of radioactive waste siting and disposal, and also to think about if we hold the willing host model as a gold standard of how to seek consent, we also need to consider how that willing host model is proceduralized, because in practice there's been a lot of glaring concerns, including who is included and left out of the host communities. And it's not only potentially affected communities, and also how and who defines willingness. So thanks so much for your time listening to that, and I'll pass it on to Ramana. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Really, really important questions, because of course nuclear is being touted as the clean energy, and without looking at the entire fuel chain, yeah, they get away with that. Okay, our final presenter is Mark Winfield. Dr. Winfield is professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. He is co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative and coordinator of the Joint Master of Environmental Studies Juris Doctor program, offered in conjunction with Osgoode Hall Law School. Mark has published many articles, book chapters, and reports on a wide range of topics related to climate change and environment and energy law and policy. Most recently, he has co-edited the 2023 book, Sustainable Energy Transitions in Canada. Mark's presentation is titled Nuclear Energy in Canada, Has a Dying Industry Found New Life? So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Janice. And like Laura, I want to acknowledge I'm here in Toronto in Southern Ontario, and to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and also note that we are in the territory covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So I'm going to focus my comments today on the politics around the apparent nuclear renaissance in Canada and what seems to propel this in political terms, particularly in terms of public perceptions. And I have a working hypothesis that some of this is just tied up with generational experience. But so looking at this where we were 5 years ago, this industry looked like it was in semi-terminal decline. The last new builds had been initiated really 50 years ago in the 1970s. The most recent attempted reactor construction project, the Maple isotope reactor, had ended in failure. Despite having got the chair of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission fired to try and get the thing approved, they still couldn't make it work. And the last serious new build proposal, which had occurred in Ontario, had been abandoned in 2009, now 15 years ago, as completely uneconomic. With respect to the existing fleet, the refurbishments of the initial fleet that was reaching end of life in the late 90s and early 2000s generally had not gone well. Went billions over budget, years behind schedule. At Pickering, 2 of the 4 units were actually written off, so not even completed. And indeed, this was the new build in Ontario, which simply was judged uneconomic. The minister at the time, George Smitherman, essentially asked the proponents to put a full cost proposal on the table, with the implication that there would be no cost or risk sharing with the province. And the estimates in terms of capital costs came in 3 to 4 times the Ontario Power Authority's planning estimates. And we're looking at delivered electricity costs somewhere in excess of 20 cents per kilowatt hour. The remaining units at Pickering A, which are the oldest, of which there were originally 4, 2 of those I mentioned had been written off through the initial refurbishment effort. Pickering B, which is another 4 units, was scheduled to close in 2018, and Quebec had closed its 1 reactor, Gentilly 2, more than a decade ago. Pickering A was reaching end of life. The remaining 2 units, numbers 1 and 4, and at least in Ontario, there were very serious debates going on about the future of Bruce and particularly Darlington. So it looked like a shaky pathway that the number of reactors was in fairly permanent decline. It looked like the Bruce refurbishment on the Bruce B and the remaining units at Bruce A was going to happen, that's 6 reactors. And ongoing debate in New Brunswick about LaPro as well. From there, in 2024, we are in a completely different universe, it seems. At Darlington, we now have an ongoing refurbishment of the 4 existing units. Estimated cost at least $13 billion. There is a proposal for 4 new reactors. They're called SMRs, but they're definitely not. At Darlington as well. Cost is unknown, although someone reliable was telling me that the Tennessee Valley Authority has been looking at the BWRX design and is coming in with a figure of $7 billion in capital cost per unit, which would put the Darlington project somewhere north of $30 billion in capital costs. There's the ongoing refurbishment of 6 units at Bruce now, and the government has proposed 4,800 megawatts of new capacity at Bruce, so 4 new reactors. My back of envelope estimate there would be 50 to 60 billion based on the cost for the previous proposals. And this February, the government announced that it would try and proceed with the Pickering B refurbishment, which had been previously assessed as both completely uneconomic and unnecessary. So we're looking somewhere north of $100 billion in commitments being made by the government of Ontario around nuclear expansion. Indeed, we have fancy TV ads now running about clean Ontario powered by clean and reliable nuclear energy. New Brunswick and Quebec are in somewhat similar conversations. New Brunswick, there's discussion of what happens with the Pro. Quebec, the Minister in Energy was talking about the possibility of trying to reopen Chantilly. Mr. Fitzgibbon is now gone from the job, and I think the question is sort of seems to be back off the table in Quebec. There is very aggressive support from the federal government. The one and only investor so far in the Darlington reactor project, the new build, is the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which is the federal government. And there is a very aggressive promotional campaign around small modular reactors. Just last week, the comment period was closed on the rules around impact assessments for nuclear, all types of projects under the Federal Impact Assessment Act. And in there are proposals basically to exempt SMR projects on existing nuclear facilities. So basically almost a get out of jail free card if you claim to be you're an SMR, or indeed there were proposals in there even if you're going to build a reactor on a brownfield former fossil fuel power plant site, you would also be off the designated project list. Aggressive provincial support as well. Ontario, New Brunswick, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Although Saskatchewan, I'm told, has now perhaps wisely decided they're going to wait and see what happens with the SMR project in Ontario before they actually proceed with anything in Saskatchewan. There may be an element of reality coming into the conversation. Perhaps the most striking thing here is the levels of public support, which I think has taken many people who followed this very, very much by surprise. This was Angus Reid, now coming up on 2 years ago, but everywhere but Quebec, they're showing majority support for nuclear expansion of some sort, particularly strong support in Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, little New Brunswick as well, even in BC, which left me a little bit suspicious about this, but the demographics here are particularly striking in the sense that support tends to go up with younger demographics, and very, very noticeably concentrated among males under the age of 30, or 35. There is a very, very distinct gender split here, as you'll see in the data that guys are way more keen about this than women are, and there's some questions there around what propels that. Charles Bird has done some further research on this, suggests that at least the enthusiasm in part flows from, well, this is seen as a relatively simple and rapid response to climate change. This is an easy way to decarbonize. It does kind of leave us with the question, well, this is a different profile in terms of public opinion from what you would have seen 5 years ago. Now, keeping in mind also that the public overwhelmingly favors renewables over other options, but clearly there is some movement here around nuclear. In terms of explaining this, I think where I'm leaning is a hypothesis that I'll put on the table for tonight. This is a question of generational transitions, and the fact that we essentially were on a kind of nuclear holiday to some degree in Canada. That because we decided against proceeding with a new build in the late 2000s, we sort of avoided the direct experience with the Renaissance in other places in Finland, France, the UK, the US, where we sort of have a succession of fantastic, ridiculous economic disasters. There is clearly a perceived non-proximity to extreme events and risks. These things happen in Japan. They happen in even Ukraine and Russia, but not necessarily in Southern Ontario or New Brunswick, even though the reality of this is quite different. This is the fallout map for a major accident at Pickering. And indeed, at our university next week, we're having a radiological incident drill, which is a function of our proximity to Pickering, and which has been required, OPG very politely telling us that this is a possibility that might exist. I think there's another dimension too, and this was something I heard raised by someone more on the peace and security side, that sort of anybody sort of post 1990, post Gen X, didn't live in the shadow of the mushroom cloud and has not really had the same kind of direct experiences with the connections between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. I mean, when I did atmospheric physics in the 1980s, the megaton equivalents we talked about in atmospheric terms were not of CO2e, they were TNTe, because we were talking about nuclear winter at that stage. Other factors seem to be at work too within certain governments, even the federal government, possibly a bad case of carbon tunnel vision. Seems to be part of the explanation here, that an exclusive focus on decarbonization and a complete failure to recognize other forms of non-carbon trade-offs, be they weapons proliferation, non-carbon environmental impacts, a range of other things. And there may also just be a failure to have separated sales pitches from reality. And there's a certain amount of reality coming home to roost that we may yet face. I mean, as the estimates of costs get closer to some notion we might build something, they just seem to keep going upwards and upwards. It's unclear how all of this is going to be financed. Questions around waste management are more acute than ever. And indeed, there's been this strange shift at NWMO, which was originally very focused on CANDU reactor wastes. And suddenly they're now out there essentially saying that they will take anything, which among other things changes the risk profile for whatever host community there might be there. So I'm just going to close off here. In the larger context of energy sustainability, the non-carbon tunnel vision of this, the fundamental trade-off is you're dealing, yes, potentially a low carbon, high volume energy source, but very, very high negative trade-off risks in virtually every other dimension of sustainability you can think of. Costs, as Ramana pointed to, and the cost profile gets worse, not better. Very high non-carbon environmental and health impacts, high levels of inflexibility, both at operational and planning levels, unique and uniquely severe catastrophic accident risks, and unique weapons and security of weapons proliferation risks that don't exist in relation to any other technology. This is the ultimate dual use technology. So at best, I would argue this is something in a sustainability context that can only be considered as a decarbonization option of last resort, when all other alternatives may have been exhausted. And I don't think we're anywhere near that point in Canada. So I'm going to leave off there, and we can move into the discussion phase. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And thanks to all the presenters. And sort of just to put a final point on the topic of the nuclear renaissance, the National Observer, I'm sure some of you saw it, last week ran an article with the title, "The AI Boom Needs Power and Lots of It. It is Looking to Nuclear for Its Source." And that's the story was that Microsoft is contracting to reopen the reactor 1, I think, at the 3 Mile Island site, the site of the first major nuclear accident in the sort of power industry in North America. So if the nuclear industry isn't enough, it's now paired up with big tech. So Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, and OpenAI, Sam Altman are all looking for nuclear power these days. Okay, so let's go to the Q&A and open it up for the audience to engage with our presenters. And also, Beatrice, maybe while we're waiting for people to get their wits about them here, is there anything in the chat that you want to share with us?
There's a big question that just appeared in the chat. I don't really think I should read the
big
whole thing. Yeah,
big
lots of
meaning
points.
long.
Very long. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if the person who shared it would want to speak, but I can also
we can
I could just find the question.
It's simpler for us to just read it. Yeah.
It's about 300 words.
Yeah, so Fred, you're here, I think. Do you want to speak to do you actually have a question falling out of your text here?
And Ole Hendrickson has his hand up too, Janice, just to let you know.
I see Ole. Fred, do you want to speak or not? Okay, well, Ole, we'll go to you.
Yeah, just quickly, I wonder if any of the speakers would want to comment about the nuclear weapons, nuclear power nexus, about that connection. Thank you.
Ramana, is that one for you?
I can jump in, yeah. I mean, I'm sure all of us can say something about that. There is definitely a strong connection. And I sort of, I categorize these connections into 5 different ways. So there is a geographical overlap between countries that have nuclear weapons and countries that operate nuclear power plants. If you look at the majority of the nuclear reactors around the world, they are in countries that have nuclear weapons. United States, Russia, China, the UK, France, India, and Pakistan. They have more than half of all nuclear power plants. And if you include countries like Canada that are in military alliances with nuclear weapon states, the overlap is overwhelming. So there's that. There's a historical overlap having to do with the fact that the first nuclear reactors were constructed to produce plutonium for the bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki, and the one that was tested in New Mexico in July 1945. There is a technical connection because all nuclear power plants require produce plutonium, and quite a few of them require enriched uranium, and the technology that is used to enrich uranium to produce fuel can also be used to make nuclear weapons grade, highly enriched weapons grade uranium. That's actually why there's a lot of concern about Iran, because Iran has a enrichment program that people suspect it might be interested in using it to make nuclear weapons. And then there is a connection in terms of the kind of training that people have to be given in order to work in a nuclear plant. Much of the training overlaps also with the training that people would need to work on nuclear weapons production and nuclear weapons materials production in particular. And lastly, if you look at the institutions that promote nuclear energy, in many countries, those same institutions also are in charge of nuclear weapons. So in the United States, it's the Department of Energy. In India, it's the Department of Atomic Energy. So these are the sort of different ways in which you can see a strong connection. And last but not least, there are lots of corporations which profit from both making nuclear weapons and or be contributing to it and in the nuclear reactor business.
Thanks, Ramana. You were totally prepared for that question. Very impressive. Gracia. Is that, have I pronounced your name properly?
Yes, Gracia, not Ole. I finally found the three dots.
Oh,
I live in
okay.
Niagara. I'm representing the National Council of Women of Canada and the Provincial Council of Ontario. And I go way back with Gordon Edwards as a friend. My question is about the media, and I'm interested in that because I've been working on issues related to GMOs and pesticides, where every time we make a breakthrough and the public seems to be really picking up that there's a problem, they come right away with articles and expert articles from everywhere to counteract. Is that happening as well? And second part of that question, several years ago, I believe it was the power workers or in Ontario, or it might have been OPG themselves, were found by the Press Council to be using false advertising. We're told to stop their advertisements. So I think, to me, if this is building up again, I think there's a need for somebody to be reacting again and trying to do something about it. So that's just my question.
Sure, I'll jump in there. So the last part of your question, it was the advertising standards or the Advertising Standards Council, I believe, and you're right. It was the nuclear industry that was found to be using false advertising, but it wasn't specifically the press. Now, maybe there was a press case that I wasn't aware of, but this was, and this particular body, the Ad Standards, has no teeth, unfortunately. So it's kind of difficult to reenact that. A number of us have tried, including Ole Hendrickson, who was just speaking. A number of us have tried to make a similar complaint to the Competition Bureau based on false advertising by the nuclear industry. It was turned down for a kind of obscure reason, but we are looking at the new greenwashing bill to see if we can somehow get something in there, and we may have some luck with that. But yes, in answer to the first part of your question about, does the nuclear industry respond? Absolutely. I mean, some of us here have worked quite a bit on the whole reprocessing issue, because that is actually being proposed by one of the SMR vendors in New Brunswick. And in relation to, as a response to that, there's been quite a bit of pushback from the industry in terms of trying to get webinars out and articles out. There was a new one that came out just quite recently, trying to say that, oh, no, we have misunderstood everything. Everything's just fine. Don't worry about it. So yeah, it's very difficult to, it's really, a lot of us think that it's really a game of words that's going on right now.
There's just one other thing that might be helpful. I'm not sure. You sometimes think the federal government is impenetrable, but individual MPs can make a difference, as the Quebec MP's been doing pretty well there. Several years ago, when the deep level Bruce site was being heard by a panel, they got their way despite all these thousands and thousands of people and everything else. But the minister, Kathleen McKenna, I think it was, put a condition on it that the First Nations had to agree. And I know Gordon Edwards was behind the scenes working with them very, very closely for quite a while. And I think that we had sent from National Council of Women, one of the members that lived in Ottawa, and the president of the Provincial Council went to meet with her prior to that and gave her the background that we knew. And she actually was very, very interested and moved by it. And she felt very negatively, but she couldn't do anything about the panel, but this is something she could throw in and throw a wrench into it. And so I know nowadays the First Nations people are really raising a lot of PR, a lot of sympathy, a lot of whether it's going to work or not. I think that's probably one of our best opportunities is through the support, which is what we've been supporting them for too. So anyway, that's what I want to
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Gracia. I've got a question here in the chat from Anne McAllister that I'll put out if that's okay. So Anne is writing to ask, what would the climate have to be like in Canada for nuclear power to become a necessary decarbonization option? For example, is wind energy no longer viable in Florida during a hurricane season? And Anne, are you talking literally climate or political climate or what? And
Because of the hurricanes in Florida, it made me kind of wonder, you know, if wind energy was even usable there anymore during hurricane season, and if, as the climate worsens, we might be on some kind of time limit for forms of renewable energy to be effective anymore. So I'm thinking environmentally.
Yeah, okay. Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I know in Ramana's book, he did talk about climate change and the nuclear industry, because of course, nuclear plants are extremely vulnerable in many locations to climate change. I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that, Ramana.
Sure, I can jump in. I think, you know, the 2 points to remember. One is during extreme weather events, all sources of power are going to become vulnerable, right? To shut down. For example, during one of the severe winters in Texas a couple of years ago, natural gas plants had to be shut down because they had not been winterized appropriately and stuff of that sort. This is going to become only too common. So there is going to be, as climate change becomes worse, we have to learn to live with this kind of disruption. I think there's no getting around that. That said, you know, it's not as though when there's a hurricane, the wind turbines come crashing down or all the solar panels stop working after that, right? There is going to be a temporary period when these things are going to be shut down, and then you can restart them once the weather clears out a little bit. But the other way to think about some of this question is nuclear power by its nature is a very centralized source of power. It's locally, there are going to be some large generation facilities, and that's how it's going to be producing power. Whereas renewables tend to be, by their very nature, very dispersed and localized. And so if there's one part of that particular ecosystem that is being affected by some weather event, it doesn't mean that every other part is going to be affected. And if they are all interconnected, then you can quickly reconnect all of these lost power sources or these areas. So there's a lot more we can talk about. I know we are sort of running out of time, so I'll keep my answer short.
Okay,
And yeah,
go ahead, finish up.
I was just going to say that, you know, I also had a look at the question that Fred had asked, and I can get to that after we get through Brené's question and so on.
Okay. Thanks, Ramana. Let's go to Brené, and then there's one more in the chat that we could get to, and then I think we have kept you probably long enough. Brené?
Thanks, Janice. So this is a question around where the impact assessment agency is going. So there's been a review underway of a couple of regulations under the Impact Assessment Act, and they put out a discussion paper, and it had a section on nuclear projects. And there was this, what struck me as a really curious statement. They said, since 2019, there have been two notable shifts in the sector, an apparent down selection in SMR technologies and a greater interest in the deployment of large-scale nuclear reactors to address the existential threat of climate change. So it has set aside that they propagandized nuclear power throughout. I don't know what to make, where they would have a source saying there's a shift, a down selection of SMR technology. So I'm wondering, Ramana, if you're seeing anything that would support that kind of statement. And I know, Susan, you track government subsidies, and I don't know if you've seen that kind of de-acceleration. And I know Mark and Laura track EA. So I'm just wondering if anyone has a sense of what that could be, if there could actually be a notable shift that only the Impact Assessment Agency has noticed today.
Yeah. Well, somebody seems to forgot to tell the government of Canada that, which is very keen on SMR still.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a fair bit of talk over the last 6 months, I would say, about whether there has been that kind of a shift, and more of a focus on large reactors. I can't really say much more about that, but for example, the article, Ramana flashed an image of that, the article that appeared recently, just within the last week, about how Alberta is now talking about not building an SMR for the tar sands. They're going to go for a big reactor because SMRs, they need something bigger. We've seen kind of a number of things like that, that there's somehow the reality of the economics of SMRs. And there's even some talk, actually, the 3 Mile Island Microsoft link. There was a meeting I was at the other day where we were talking about, did they deliberately pick 3 Mile Island just because they knew it would get massive global publicity and get people talking again about how much we need nuclear? Wow, they're so desperate, they're going to open up 3 Mile Island. So, because they don't need to open up 3 Mile Island, right? They don't need that. And so is this just part of some massive publicity thing to get people talking about nuclear and big reactors again? Anyway, that's all I can add to that, Brene.
Okay, does anyone else, Ramana, did you want to speak to that?
No, I mean, I think there's nothing very definitive one can say. These are just, statements like this keep getting made all the time. A few years ago, everybody was saying no more large reactors, only SMRs, and then SMRs are sort of not coming up as fast as they want it to be. So then they start talking about large reactors. But also, it's that there are companies like SNC-Lavalin, which want to build large reactors, and they're very powerful as well. And once they see that there's more support for nuclear power, they jump on the bandwagon and say, forget about SMRs, we can build the old CANDOs or whatever latest versions of that. So this is all just, inside baseball kind of trading going on.
Yeah. I'm going to go to a question in chat, and then I'll get you, Murray. I said this would be the last, but I'm always interested in raised hands. So this is from a student of mine. Hi, Mars. In Winfield's presentation, Marks, he mentioned there was a striking difference between men and women under 34 and their opinion on nuclear power. Is there a study on the reason why? I am so curious.
So am I. I'm talking to my students about this, particularly the male ones. And the gender split is across all age demographics. Like it's very, very pronounced. And although the level of support, which we would normally think is slightly bizarre, at least under males, goes up the younger they get. Say Charles Bird's work on this, he's now at Tufts, suggests that the sale that sort of worked is that, oh, well, this is the fastest way to respond to the climate crisis, seems to be one theory. My other theory, of course, is that it's just too much post-nuclear apocalypse gaming, and that the encounter with the zombies went okay, and so it wouldn't be so bad. That's my best theory at the moment. I'm sort of talking to my own demographically appropriate focus groups to try and get a better answer. But that seems to be the best explanation. Now, the industry also has had, as Susan was hinting at, there's some very, very slick social media advertising that's been going on that's very definitely aimed at those demographics, especially the younger male. And that clearly has found some traction with those constituencies as well. So that's my best explanation. Clearly requires further investigation in a more formal kind of way, but clearly the industry has successfully targeted that demographic. And I think it also goes back to these questions, essentially, there's sort of been this generational gap in which we didn't really talk about nuclear very much because we thought it was in a pretty terminal decline. And so, a lot of the history that many people who've dealt with this issue over time have just isn't there. So the industry realized they had a blank slate with the sort of younger demographics, and have been very, very skillful in sort of speaking to that demo. You know, clearly they hired some very good advertising people to speak to those demographics. So that's the other possible explanation. The combination, there's no generational memory, plus very, very slick and skillful social media work has produced this result.
Okay, Murray, thanks for waiting. And I think this really should be our final question, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Janice. And I really have to thank all the speakers. Just absolutely interesting and increased my knowledge so much. I appreciate being involved with this group. I'm a physician in Saskatchewan. I'm the co-chair of the Canadian chapter, or the Saskatchewan chapter of CAPE, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And so I'm very interested because Saskatchewan is, you know, a province rich in uranium and lots of political push to move towards nuclear, even, you know, down the road. So my two-part question is, the first one, from a medical lens, how much nuclear reactor activity do we need to keep up with the supply of nuclear isotopes for medical imaging? So, you know, for lots of our cancer diagnoses and bone scanning and so forth, we need isotopes. And so we do need some nuclear reactors for that. Wonder if there's an answer. And then kind of the bigger one is, I'm really curious if any of the speakers have an estimate of the cost of our, you know, better renewable systems with wind and solar and battery storage. How much would it cost to generate the amount of electricity that Mark mentioned, that $100+ billion is potentially being invested in nuclear? Would the cost be similar for wind and solar to get that much electricity, or be way less, is what I'm thinking. So maybe just comments on that. Thanks again.
I'm just going to say one thing and then turn it over to others who know more than I do. But there's a big difference between research reactors and power reactors. And as far as I understand, you don't need power reactors to make medical isotopes or medical devices of any kind. So that is one thing. And then there's also that a lot of the isotopes don't need nuclear reactors at all. But it's part of what the industry is doing right now. One of their selling points is to say we need power reactors to make medical isotopes, which, as far as I understand, is just not accurate. But maybe others can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, isotope reactors are a completely different type of animal, for lack of a better way to put it. Things that go in the basements of small buildings and things like that, but are not producing power of any consequence. I mean, they are apparently getting some production, but it's pretty tiny. And part of this, of course, is the last time they tried to build a reactor in Canada was for isotope production, and they failed completely. On the larger, so you know, you could conceivably build an isotope reactor would normally have absolutely no relationship to power production at all. Secondly, on the cost, well, where we seem to be landing reasonably consistently on new build nuclear is delivered electricity costs, at least in the mid-20s to 30s per kilowatt hour. Wind plus storage is now coming in the 10 cents per kilowatt hour range. So and there's all kinds of other rounds to that too. I mean, I would look at the work the David Suzuki Foundation did, which actually did model out using very, very sophisticated models, pathways to net zero for Canada that phase out fossil fuels and also see a rundown on nuclear as well. There's also work done by the Atmospheric Fund in Toronto that looks specifically at Ontario, and again, similar questions around net zero grid, assuming much larger efforts on energy efficiency and renewables. And again, came out certainly no need for new build, no need for Pickering B, and also a gas phase out in Ontario, which is a very significant issue being feasible as well. So we've got quite a lot of modeling out there, which tells us that there are pathways that are viable and are definitely cheaper. So that's kind of where we sit there. I know somebody at University of Regina is looking specifically at Saskatchewan in terms of these questions around what does natural pathway to net zero look like. But renewables plus storage, partially because of what Ramana showed on one of his slides, was you've had a very definite learning curve in terms of declines in costs and improvements in ability to performance and management. And one of the defining features of nuclear has been there is no learning curve, that the cost curve keeps going up, not down. And that's very important to keep in mind here, that there is we've seen the technological breakthroughs on renewables, we've seen them in storage, and then crucially also in the software, the which you might call smart grids or whatever else, but the ability to integrate and control distributed resources. And on the nuclear side, the bottom line is there is no technological breakthrough that's happened here that fundamentally alters the sort of cost curve in the same sense of going from an incandescent light bulb to an LED light bulb. That just hasn't happened. But I mean, the technologies they're largely talking about things I've been talking about for the last 60 or 70 years. There's no big news here, whereas we are definitely seeing multiple converging technological breakthroughs in renewables, storage, and grid management, which really do change the landscape fairly fundamentally.
Okay, on that
Ramana, I think,
positive.
wants to get on this one too.
Oh, sure, Ramana.
Yeah.
Fred had written this long question. I think I would like to address that very briefly, not at that same length, but just to say that, when you think about nuclear reactor construction and small modular reactors and so on, there are going to be a number of other organizations that are going to profit from it. And so you can expect them to support, right? And this includes not just the kind of militarized responses that Fred mentions, but everything going from legal firms that are going to try and write up contracts to consulting companies and engineering firms of all kinds, and universities that get grants for their PhD students. All of them you will expect to support that. However, it's important to remember that the high cost of nuclear power also means lots of profits for those companies that build those, as long as they can pass the cost on to customers and taxpayers. And those are the only conditions under which nuclear reactors typically get built, right? And so you don't have to look for all these, secondary motives when there's a primary motive of huge profits for those companies that are building it. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Ramana, for tackling that, and thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, I want to thank everybody in the audience for participating tonight, for listening and encouraging this amazing group of researchers who are dedicating a lot of time and gray matter to this really important issue. So thank you to the audience, and on behalf of the audience, thank you to our presenters tonight. You've provided a wealth of knowledge and insight regarding this hollow promise of nuclear power as a solution to climate change. So with that, I will say good evening and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Maybe somebody can save the chat. I think there's some very interesting comments there.
It will be saved with the recording.
Great.
So I'll stop the recording there.
Thanks.